Everyone, thanks for showing up so early. I'm just going to jump right in. We've got a lot of material to cover. We'll try to leave some questions at the end, we'll try to leave some time at the end for some questions from the audience. So let me introduce the panel, first of all. I'll start with the far right, or my far right. This is Roy Catmore. He's co-founder and CEO of Ensilo. Prior to Ensilo, Roy was Akamai's security strategy manager, and he also managed Imperva's data security products. Roy, of course, served in the Israeli military, like all Israelis do, and after that he worked at Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, which was a government-owned contractor at the time. Now it's an independent contractor. At Rafael, he worked in the cyber division. Next to him is Gary Brown, professor of cybersecurity at Marine Corps University. Prior to that, he served for 24 years as a judge advocate with the U.S. Air Force and was the first senior legal counsel for U.S. Cyber Command, where he was from 2010 until 2012. He was also the official U.S. observer to the drafting of the Tallinn Manual on international law applicable to cyber warfare. And closest to me here is Oren Falkowitz, CEO and co-founder of Area 1 Security. Oren is an ex-NSA hacker with the NSA's TAO group. So we're going to, we had some debate in our discussion prior to the panel of whether or not we should address the issue of what is the definition of cyber warfare and digital weapons. Just because the words are bandied about and they're used and misused. And so I wanted to start with this, asking the panelists, and we won't spend too much time on this, we don't want to bore you, but what do we mean when we talk about cyber weapons and cyber warfare? Do we have to define the terms, and does it matter? And anyone can jump in on that.
Right, so I'll start, since being the lawyer in the group, I guess. I love definitions. I'll try not to bore you, though, because it is important to define things in the field, not for the many sort of really boring legal reasons, which are also valid, but because in this area we're still setting expectations between states. So one of the things we're interested in international relations is making sure that states understand what the other states are trying to do. So we debate all the time about did this act cross some threshold that might drive us to armed conflict or conflict between the states. So it's important that we have some shared understandings. The Tallinn Manual on the international law applicable to cyber warfare has, it's an interesting read because as you look at weapons, so I'm talking about attack at first because weapon and attack are sort of feed each other, because an attack is something you do with a weapon, and a weapon is something used in an attack. So they're sort of two sides of the same coin. The Tallinn Manual looks at cyber weapons as a cyber capability that damages, destroys property, or kills or injures people. So it's a really traditional definition. The problem with trying to expand it further, which for one example the U.S. Air Force has tried to do in its definition, is that we start gathering in capabilities that are really espionage capabilities and not attack capabilities. And of course, again, as we look at this expectation between states engage in espionage all the time, and that doesn't drive us across any threshold. So it's important we not gather those things in. And the Air Force definition talks about denial or degrading data and that kind of thing, and data is not really part of the definition, the one that's most accepted in international law. But the main thing is, as we go forward, we're sort of moving, as the lawyers are debating over the definition using traditional outlines of cyber weapons, we sort of moved beyond the type of incident we had in Stuxnet and more to incidents that are aimed at data or information, and so that's a completely different area, and we still haven't figured out the first one, and we've moved on.
I mean, I agree with you. Words.
It's not working.
No, it's not working. That's so wonderful.
Use this one? Use it.
I agree with you. Words matter, and it's important to have definitions. But one of the challenges in this space is always the pace at which innovation gets in front of doctrine and policy and law. And I think, only a few years ago, the notion of warfare in cyberspace would have been something akin to something that blows up, or a digital Pearl Harbor. And what we've seen over the last year, particularly related to the elections, that the future might be only data and might be more financial or might be more information based. And we need to consider that as potentially what's more valuable going forward. And that's been a trend in the military warfare as well.
Roy, is there a different definition in Israel?
I think in Israel it's more defined as, since we're in a constant war, so warfare and all that is kind of things that we take off, and it's more considered as a cyber operations, and each part of the cyber operation, which could be from different angles, not necessarily the cyber weapons, but it could be a cyber operation, meaning we'll talk about that later, about techniques and about how you do stuff, but it also needs to be considered that it not necessarily brings to a war in that definition. So that's a legal term of what you can get out of a cyber operation, but the operation is complex and it's built out of many other aspects that are not necessarily covered out in that, let's say, definition per se. So more complex than this, more operational, can require more parties to be involved, but I'm sure we're going to touch all these later on.
Okay. So I wanted just to, since we've got Stuxnet in the title, and of course that's considered what many believe to be the first digital weapon, at least that we know about. So I wanted to address, first of all, what did Stuxnet do right and what were its mistakes?
Yeah. So we don't know for sure, since nobody's claimed responsibility for doing it. We don't know for sure what their goal was or what they were trying to accomplish. But if they were trying to, the institutors of the action were trying to accomplish setting back the Iranians' uranium enrichment program, it appears to have worked. Although there's debate about that as well and how it recovered, and et cetera. But it appears to have worked for that. I also think a thing it did well is that its distribution and its effect on things that weren't actual targets of the activity was limited. So it distributed widely, essentially around the globe, but it didn't have really any detrimental impact on the machines it landed on, except for the targeted machines.
I think.
Use the other mic.
I think the thing that Stuxnet did well is expose people to the imaginative power that advanced actors or hackers can have, and that's often the thing that's most misunderstood in cyber operations. That the real advantage for the attacker against the defender is not one of technical skill or sophistication, but one of imagination. And very few people could imagine that such an operation could be carried out and that would be effective. And once people start to realize that, that is really the thing that opens up more opportunities for even greater offensive capabilities, or potentially for defenders to take back the advantage.
I think that a lot of that takes me back to the operation way. Is that one? I think people understood that anywhere and any place could be reached, and that's kind of maybe what Oren referred to, the imagination. But there's a lot of help from other ways to get in, and that's something that the main reason why countries and states are more related to these kind of things. So if you take a hacker as opposed to a nation attack, what you're going to see is that they got more power to get closer and do stuff that it's hard as a remote hacker to do. But when you have a state behind that, you can have other parts of the operation that can get it closer, which means with people, with equipment, with packages that can reach the right places, with vans that can stand in the right place, with other technologies that can be closer to close all kind of gaps that you need to be closer. So I think that was done very well. So kind of you can reach anywhere, any place. The thing that we're not done good is it's not about just the distribution of the code and how it went a bit wild after that. So everybody's talking about the migration to the public sector and in general to everywhere else. But the thing was that this code, and we'll talk maybe later about how these tools look now, but it was running pretty wild. When we talk about lateral movement, which is kind of the part of the cyber kill chain, the thing ran to machine that it was not supposed to be there, and you need to keep in mind that the idea of being stealthy is to be able to jump between those machines, but not necessarily jump to machines that are not relevant to the operation. Just makes you more detectable in a way. So that definitely happened in that kind of attack. What also was done good, so we'll jump between bad and good, was the exploit that was actually used was let's say a very by design vulnerability, which is something that we see more and more, and that definitely becomes bigger and bigger. So the link, the way they used it, the exploit itself.
I don't mean to interrupt you. You're talking about the LNK zero-day exploit?
Right.
Okay.
So the way the exploit that was used was a vulnerability by design. It's a good comment, because basically this is the way the system actually works. So there was nothing broken. There's not a huge thing to do it. They just used vulnerability by the design of the software provider, and that's a very smart and nice way to do it. It's very smooth. It goes in, and so that's another good thing. And I think by end of day, the goal, as it seemed to be, was achieved, which means with all of that, the summary is that it was a successful operation.
Does anyone else have any comments on mistakes made in Stuxnet? Something that struck me was the fact, I mean, the whole reason we know what Stuxnet did was the fact that the encryption keys were embedded in the malware itself. And we've seen malware since then, Gauss, for example, where the encryption key is not in the malware, but the decryption key is something that's on the target system, some configuration of the target system that no one knows. And so therefore, researchers haven't been able to take that apart. So is that a mistake of Stuxnet, or was that the only way that they could do that? No one has a response to that? Okay, let's move on to state of the art then, because when Stuxnet was discovered in 2010, it was considered state of the art. And so I'm wondering now, Roy, you've said that you felt like Stuxnet now is kind of old school. So what are the advancements that we've seen? How have digital weapons advanced since then?
We touched one point before, so you need to understand that, I guess, when you're looking at a cyber operations, there's a lot of things that can go bad. And that's not necessarily about the coding itself, but it's a lot about how to close things that you can't even reach, and how you can trigger things that you, again, cannot necessarily reach, and they change over time. So it's not that you have a perfect cyber weapon. I think it's about capabilities and the use of capabilities for different manners and or different goals. So it's not a one that can do it as everybody thinks. There's several of them that you need to use for different phases of a cyber operations. But if you look at more new kind of operations, you're going to see, if you again take a cyber kill chain, you see the exploits themselves, they need to be stable. We used to see, and it's not just in Stuxnet, we used to see all kind of exploits that were just not stable. And today I think that if somebody sees a panic, which means the system crashed, or a blue screen, which means again the system crashed, people look deeper into that and see it as a more indication of something, especially when you're in a sensitive places. So stability is definitely a key. And everything basically was seen in the last 2 years was very stable. You want things that could be remotely exploitable, which basically means you can put some things there, and always remember, states has ability to get closer than anybody else, but you want something you can trigger remotely. And that's not as easy as it looks, because it's not the typical command and control that you can remote everything, because you can't have this communication. You need other things to make that exploitable. This is another thing that you see. The remote exploitable tactics are something that is kind of common right now, and that also makes it a very a better tool. Cross platforms and cross OSs is something that was. There used to be tools that we used to jump only on certain machines, certain platforms that they fit. Now you see something that can run almost on anything bundled in a tool, or knows that it can and it won't even try. So that's definitely another thing that you have to have in a perfect world, let's say that way. Privileges is something that was always needed, but we see now that it's always great to have, but the problem with that is that you can have the user to be interactive with this. So as much as, you can get it easily in Windows, and you just like, hey, this app requires more permission. Do you approve? And you click OK, think that this cannot happen. So you can't have it there. I think if you're looking at this, without going deeper into this, you see more what I mentioned before, the vulnerabilities by design. So if you look at the last 2 years, look at attacks, look even more than this, even in the Ukraine, Russia attack, the sandworm, that was a pretty, I would say, almost simple attack, but it was brilliant in that way Because again, they use a flow in the way Office works. That's the way it works. So if you have any anomaly or you have, this is how it works. So by design, and we see this by design, vulnerability is being used more and more, and the more of them in certain attacks. If you look at the lateral movement, that's where states has a huge advantage. So as opposed to just jumping between machines, which of course wants to be very stealthy, and that's exactly going back to the Stuxnet point that you can't jump to machines that are not relevant to the operation. The second piece is how do you close air gaps? And air gaps are becoming now top-of-the-art technologies that you can basically say, hey, there is no connectivity, how can you do it? But keep in mind, a lot of IoTs are coming in, and somebody walking with his Apple Watch can be very useful. If a computer can use a lot of radio frequencies right now, it's something that is becoming very big to basically close air gaps. There's a lot of technologies around this, and drones, and forces around it, from boxes being delivered to places, to vans that are stopping in the right places, to antennas that are right in the right places. You can close air gaps, and this is things that only state can actually do. That means jumping between devices that has no communication between them. So that's another thing. You need to keep in mind that these, once you're in, the top of the art, what you see right now is, one, being very stealthy, which is hard over time. But the second piece is being persistent on the box, which means that take into consideration a lot of governmental, a lot of those sectors, what they'll do is, of course, they'll try to wipe the machines when they're getting a new box.
Yeah, I don't think that the definition of state-of-the-art weapons is a technical. It has anything to do with technical details. It has to do with two things. One, it has to do with people's ability to see opportunities that didn't exist before. That is what really is most scary. Folks who are today committed to stealing $1 billion from the world financial system. Systems that we thought were ironclad, that have been designed in very specific ways or esoteric, and people are finding very clever ways to do it. And what makes them sophisticated is not the technical details. Most of the technical aspects that you're talking about are well established in academic research. They're only limited to nation states. But what separates really sophisticated attacks is their ability to be full spectrum, for them to be not just about what happens on the keyboard, but to include other aspects. And that is has to do with the infrastructure. If you steal $1 billion, the problem isn't necessarily stealing the money, it's how do you get it and cash out and do things? How do you have the infrastructure to expand? You can't just set up 100 empty bank accounts overnight that are going to accept that kind of money. So we need to expand our view on what is state-of-the-art beyond technical nuances and more towards the strategy that folks will employ. And that's increasingly seeming to be information-based warfare attacks versus things that explode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sharing our mic here. Yeah, so in many ways, Roy and Oren have laid out exactly the problem with the state-of-the-art in policy and law as we go forward, because how do we consider pre and placed capabilities? I mean, if you find a system is penetrated and you have reason to believe it's a nation state, how do you determine what the intent of the nation state is? So yeah, if the state of the art is putting things in place in advance, that's great, but what's the state of the art on the strategy policy side as far as the response to what that is? But I do agree that these destructive capabilities are very important inside the context of an actual traditional conflict. But what's happening now, typically the cyber events are happening outside the context of a normal traditional conflict. So what do we call it?
Most of our military actions are happening outside of the context of a traditional military conflict. We are not engaged in those types of legal battles in any domain today. Our exploration of using special forces and drones and doing special operations and all the things that have happened over the last 10 years in the fight against terrorists and nuclear proliferators and also in cyberspace just means that the future is really outside of the traditional doctrine.
Well, yeah, it's a debate, and I'm not going to. It's the wrong panel to debate it, but
it's a reality. Yeah,
the United States claims they're still involved in an armed conflict. So.
Let me, so if we're talking about sort of either techniques or strategy, what are the ideal characteristics of a digital weapon? One of the things that was problematic with Stuxnet, of course, was that it was a worm and you couldn't recall it. So what are the ideal characteristics of a sound digital weapon?
So maybe, as we've sort of touched on already, the real ideal characteristics of a digital weapon now is really that it's wouldn't meet the definition of a weapon, right? It wouldn't destroy anything or damage anything. It would just be on standby to degrade your adversary's ability to use the system, but keep it completely intact for when you would like to use it after whatever conflict you're in or whatever disagreement you're in. So things like ransomware, that's kind of an ideal weapon where you can encrypt data or encrypt systems so that you can restore them without much loss of capability, but your adversary can't use them at all. That's a sort of a perfect quote-unquote weapon.
Yeah, I think that an ideal digital weapon has two key characteristics. One, it achieves a desired outcome, and the second, it replaces a traditional military or other facet of state government or other person's capabilities while reducing immediate impact and arm-to-arm kind of conflict.
So I'll add to that the third piece that I would add to those 2 points is that the idea to be under the radar. So the more we won't hear about it, the better they operate, the better it actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very important, right, to groups like where I worked, right, the not being caught and sort of being stealthy. But I think what we're seeing now and sort of the way information is spread, that is not as important because it's possible to counter that with a lot of misinformation. Even with all of the attacks that have happened in the last year related to the election and the Panama Papers, there's a lack of understanding about who's doing it, even though authorities and really credible experts can point and can make attribution claims. People don't trust those, and the need to be technically stealthy has, I think, evaporated.
Yeah, but the end of the day, that's exactly, you explained the result of the stealthy, good, successful operation. That's exactly where there's more of conspiracies and lack evidence to back anything about that, and that's what made it successful. So that's, I would agree, but that's as a result, not as a goal.
In terms of sort of the structure of a digital weapon, I understand sort of what you're talking about. It needs to be able to replace conventional warfare and obviously succeed. But should a digital weapon have the ability to be recalled or to be disabled remotely if conditions change, for example, or if it turns out to be having consequences that you didn't intend? Should that be sort of a parameter for a digital weapon?
No.
Why not?
Well, it would be inconsistent with a lot of other types of weapons, like ballistic missiles, for instance. Once they go, you can't bring it back, and that's interesting. But that is a question for lawyers and for people who think about risk calculus. It's not important to. Sorry, Gary. It's not.
I'll answer it.
It's not important to the people who are executing the operations for the weapons to have success. I would argue that something as simple as a phishing email could be a digital weapon where it elicits a user to take an action, maybe hit a button or send some files out or download something. And it's a very cheap weapon, but if it's effective, and we see that the asymmetry of attacks is troublesome to a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm. Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with what Oren said. In a perfect world, you'd be able to recall any weapon, but the fact of the matter is it's a pretty high bar, and most of the time we have weapons that actually blow things up and kill people, and we can't recall those many times. At some point after we've released them, we can't recall them, so it's maybe unrealistic to expect cyber capabilities to have that.
Okay. After Stuxnet, everyone assumed that we would see a lot of copycat attacks that were targeting critical infrastructure. And we didn't see that, or at least we don't know if there have been other attacks that were similar to that, other than we had the hack of the Ukraine power grid. But instead, what we've got is sort of a blindside attack. The election hack is what I'm referring to. And in retrospect, that hack seems entirely obvious and long overdue. So what do you guys see coming down the pike in terms of what we're going to see, either in sort of digital warfare that causes destruction or information warfare?
No, this is a perfect example of how it's important to lay out thresholds and expectations, because For example, the United States had been on the receiving end of destructive cyber attacks and really not responded very aggressively to those. And then this one comes along, which was essentially an espionage operation followed by the release of information. And not to take sides, but as you and I talked about, Kim, that's one definition of journalism, right? They got information they weren't supposed to have, and then they published it. It's difficult to put that. It's difficult under a traditional construct to say that's more aggressive than breaking things on a system. But I do think the very fact that is difficult to categorize under the legal system we have now is one of the reasons why it's so popular, because it's difficult to call states out for that kind of behavior.
You know, I think everyone in this room knows that people are interested in elections. That's not a new phenomenon. Republicans were interested in Democratic National Committee's information, you know, in the 70s and went to extreme lengths to break in. The Chinese tried to hack John McCain, or did successfully hack John McCain during his run for president. So, you know, the attention to the problem is new. What is striking about these attacks is how little action people are taking in front of them, right? They're not anticipating or imagining what could happen, and that gives the attackers the opportunity to be successful. The fact that the information from potential future presidents of the United States was sought by foreign governments, I can't imagine surprises anybody in this room or even in this city.
So in terms of imagination, where do you see these going? I mean, are we going to see doxing of undercover CIA agents? What do you see? Where is this going?
I think right now you see a very, what we call, in a way, soft attacks. It's the collateral damage, and I think it's got a lot to do with legal and maybe with the fact that we're putting it as a cyber warfare. I think, like anything else, it doesn't seem like, unless they actually want to do this, that anybody is actually putting it into a war per se. I mean, military war. And I think what you see, and that's a lot to do with the Stuxnet, did happen after or not happen after. The fact, technically again, is going to be that this vulnerability, for example, wasn't patched all the way. And in 2015, it was actually revealed that it was still kind of useful and could still be exploited. Whether it was or not, it's a different question. But I think that everybody understands here that if somebody can take a dam and open it as a change of a parameter, as long as, you know, I don't think imagination is anywhere anymore. I think everybody understands that it can be hacked almost everywhere. So, you know, being paranoid or not, that's part of the deal. But we don't see a lot of those. Maybe we don't know about a lot of those. But the collateral damage of making one of those is not going to be a secret. So I think right now we see a soft attack. It might be going bigger. Once a real war is going to start between two nations, we're going to see much more than that. But right now it's a soft attack, and it might have a lot to do with legal and attentions.
I disagree that the attacks are soft. You know, right today, many of the large financial institutions that we all bank with have money that leaves people's accounts. And today,
referring more to infrastructure, less than money. Money is a one way. Yeah, it's a mean on that. I totally understand, but I was referring more because the idea was about Stuxnet and infrastructure, critical infrastructure in general, so I was referring more to that.
Well, banking is critical infrastructure, but the point that I'm making is that today, you know, most people are unaware that money is being withdrawn from their accounts because it's being replaced. But what you're going to see is these attacks, companies are going to start to say, I can't afford to do that anymore. And what is considered soft or is behind the scenes today is going to have serious impacts on people, because there's going to be a lot of loss of confidence. It's going to happen in the financial sector, and information is the sort of next sort of extension of that. If people can't trust any of the information that they have, whether it's about their financial system, whether it's about their healthcare records, whether it's about, you know, people that you're hiring, people that you're trying to date online, like, it's going to be extremely challenging to live, and those aren't soft attacks. Those go right to the very foundation of how we operate as a society, both here in the United States as well as around the world.
Talking about sort of trust and integrity in systems, we saw in the first Gulf War with the Patriot missiles, there was a bug, a software bug, that prevented the Patriot missiles from actually detecting incoming missiles and exploding them. You know, it doesn't take much imagination to think how you could do that intentionally. So I'm wondering about your thoughts on in terms of our own weapon systems, not our digital weapons, but our conventional weapons, they're all run on software now. What are you seeing there in terms of potential?
Yeah, so this is I think this is a huge concern for every developed nation that uses sophisticated weapon systems. And again, this goes back to the point I was making before with what do you do when you find out that some other nation state has placed malware or has somehow penetrated the supply chain and has a capability resident on your weapon system? How do you react to that? Is that already, because if they could put it into effect at any point that they want, have they already really crossed the threshold into armed conflict? This is one of the issues we're struggling with as far as expectations go in states. What do they expect from each other, and what will be the reaction when they find out these things have been done?
Well, again, what I would say is that traditional weapon systems, Kim, are used very infrequently. You don't launch a lot of missiles at people. That happens sort of rarely. And my point in saying that it does.
Is that disagreement in the audience?
At people, we launch a lot of ICBMs at
Not
people.
ICBMs.
Well,
No.
okay. Okay. But my point is that fielded weapons, right, are not the best part to attack. Right? It's the development, the research, the testing, the evaluation. There's whole processes before these that can destroy confidence, that can delay programs, that can create budget overruns, right, to get into futureness. If you worry too much about sort of the obscure and rare, then you miss all these imaginative opportunities where attackers take advantage of how the designs from Lockheed get in, whether or not the screws that kind of tie things together are fitted just properly. And the real effect could be just delaying programs. It could be just people losing confidence that these programs will ever be delivered. And that hurts military commanders to think about strategy as they think about deploying things. But thinking about that code will be injected into a Tomahawk cruise missile and somehow the right cruise missile at the point of launch and some conflict that we don't know is going to happen on some unknown country, and then you're going to be able to trigger that is really not a very practical thought for how someone might attack such a system.
I want to switch sort of to the decision-making process on this, because when I was working on the Stuxnet book, I'd interviewed General Michael Hayden and sort of asked him about, I went into the book thinking that Stuxnet couldn't possibly be the first digital weapon, that there had to have been others that the U.S. used. And I came out of the book actually believing the opposite, that it was indeed the first digital weapon. And when I talked with Hayden, he was bemoaning the legal restrictions that the Army has, and how when commanders and officers and authorities in policymaking even thought of doing a digital weapon, launching a digital weapon, they basically silenced themselves because they knew all of the barriers that they were up against. So talk a little bit about that decision-making process. And also, we have evidence or reporting on a couple of incidences that were considered and not followed through for particular reasons. During the Gulf War, there had been the government had been considering going after Saddam Hussein's bank accounts, financial, and the Secretary of Treasury intervened because he felt like that there was too much risk of collateral damage and sort of cascading effects in the financial industry, and then also in the Libyan uprising, when UN forces were going to go in, the US considered taking out the communication systems with a digital attack, and they decided against it. So talk about that decision-making process and the barriers and difficulties.
Well, I think what you're describing is exactly the success of something like a Stuxnet, right? It's able to overcome all of the non-technical barriers to actually be implemented and executed, and to show others, right, that this is something that could be successful, and to make them maybe think about it differently. Those challenges are very real. We all know that policymakers and lawyers are significantly behind almost every technology issue of our day, whether it's backdoor encryption, whether it's digital weapons, whether it's privacy, data rights. And so, the ability to, one, not only see the potential to do something remotely with a computer, but then also to be able to convince the troglodytes that work in any bureaucratic organization that this would be a good idea, and that you could create safeguards, or you could put it into a framework that really doesn't make sense, whether it's nuclear or special operations. That is the real genius of these things, not the technology. Anybody can build these tools. There are a lot of smart people. being able to successfully execute that. And we've seen that not only in the Stuxnet example, but in the reporting around what happened in the election, people suggested that was approved by Vladimir Putin. And so to me, what that says is that people are very careful about how they deploy these things, and it requires a very senior amount of authority, which is unlike most weapon systems today. But as they become more frequent, people become emboldened, and those practices will sort of diminish.
Gary, do you want to defend the troglodytes?
I are one, so yeah, I guess I will. There are a couple of reasons, I think, why we've had such a complex process to approve digital weapons, at least in the U.S. and I think across the West. One of them, I guess, is fairly obvious, and that is I think we in the West were reluctant to open up Pandora's box, as General Hayden says, because we have the most to lose. We're the most vulnerable on this side because we have the most developed economy and industrial plant in the world, on this side. So we didn't really want to legitimize going after cyber infrastructure and that kind of thing. So that was one concern. The other one is this is different than traditional warfare because there's more of a direct contact or I guess conflict between traditional military operators and the intelligence community because remembering that military guys like to break things. Blow things up, break things, kill people. That's what the military does. The intelligence community likes to gather information, and those two things, in many instances, are sort of fundamentally incompatible. You gather intelligence up to a point, then you use the intelligence to carry out the military attack, and then the intelligence source has gone. So it's there's always a built-in conflict between the two. And
well, I would just say that conflict has almost entirely evaporated since the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The merging between intelligence operations and capture-kill missions and the use of drones and CIA drone programs, this is something that is not unique to this space. And to suggest so, I think, doesn't take an appropriate look at actually what the future of warfare is more likely to be. And in the prior administration, their vision for the future of warfare was special operators, SEAL teams going in covertly, on special platforms with drones, with robots, non-kinetic options. These things have merged.
Yeah, it's a longer conversation, Norm, but I'd have to say I fundamentally disagree with the fact that conflict has gone away. I think it's still very active. It may not be quite, the intelligence community maybe doesn't have the supremacy they used to have, but much of the conflict's gone away because military functions have transferred to the command of the intelligence community. So that's one way to buy in. Anyway, so that's.
There are 16 agencies in the United States intelligence community. The overwhelming majority of them are part of the Department of Defense. It is a pure military function.
Roy, before you jump in, I just want to we're running out of time, so if you guys have questions, feel free to start lining up and we'll go after. So Roy, I wanted to ask you sort of the decision-making process in Israel and also the idea of sort of centralized approval. Oren, you talked about Putin being sort of finger-pointed as the authorizing person behind this, the DNC hack. But what happens if that goes decentralized, if you don't have a single person making these decisions? And Roy, you have actually examples in Israel.
So I think, I definitely can't speak about the states part of it, but in Israel, you can see, I think what Oren described is actually what's going on in Israel right now. So if you would have gone in Israel like 10 years ago, any kind of, it won't be hard to say that every colonel, lieutenant could have approved an operation. That's basically how far it went, and there's a lot of units, some of them, many of those are in the army, but many of those are police, the Israeli FBI, CIA is the same. Equivalent parties had their own. What we've seen is that if you're looking right now with what's going on, it's more, the army has the most capabilities, we can talk about that, but that's kind of the migration that happened because the industry and the security kind of bloomed, and a lot of government guys actually went private. And these companies are now leading. So the only way for a country like Israel, where reserve basically drafting is an obligation, basically means that there's a lot of techies, a lot of young guys that have to join the army, and they're in the right units. They train them, and so the army, in a way, is now the main resource. And it seems like if you're going even forward with this, now the country uses more of the army abilities and its own, and what we internally called the kind of umbrella, which is mainly a one arm that has all the capabilities, more of the tools, and everybody are utilizing them according to what they need. And the approval is much more structured right now, to a point that it seems like there might even be a troop for cyber just as part of the army, and that's basically what might happen in the coming years. But it basically takes it back that, when we, without taking the dispute or yes or no intelligence or not, I think right now in Israel it is. So the intelligence and everybody are using the army capabilities. They are becoming the biggest power in having this. The decision making is very structural right now, and that definitely didn't happen 10 years ago.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions. Let's start with the audience.
Okay, thanks for the nice trip down memory lane from my own days in the interagency. Question for you. Yesterday, Brad Smith from Microsoft called for a digital Geneva Convention. What do we think the prospects are, given the complexities and issues we've talked about here, of reasonably negotiating something like that?
Zero? Do you think?
I mean, I guess, Gary, we just have to disagree on everything, right? It's so unfortunate because you're such a nice guy. But, I think that the prospects for international norms are good, but they take time, and they're imperfect. The Geneva Convention is not perfect in and of itself today, and I think this is a good place. Often cyber and nuclear policy are conflated, and that's not a good thing. But I think this is a place where this is a good model, because over the last 40, 50 years, we've negotiated many bilateral and multinational nuclear treaties, and they improve upon themselves, and they create a framework that has, I think, done a lot of good. It's imperfect always. But the prospects for this, at least starting, and you can see that through the bilateral agreements between the United States and China, are something that we should all welcome, as we also strengthen our technological advances, our advancement of strategy. It's just one feather in the cap.
Sure. Nobody would dispute that we should work toward that, but there's a fundamental difference between developing international norms, which are non-binding, and a Geneva Convention, a binding treaty. And I think the norms are developing, but norms are just behaving nicely to each other with no enforcement mechanism.
That's how you would start, though.
Well, right, but so maybe that will coalesce into a convention way down the road, but it's I think the prospects are pretty drear right now.
Question over there.
Yes. Hi, Joe Slowick. I'm currently at Los Alamos National Lab, prior naval officer working in this space. So question about, the future. So Stuxnet, if you look at that, it was a very focused weapon designed against Siemens Step 7 PLCs for, arguably a very specific purpose. Moving forward, like talking about the elections or the equation group or, pick an APT, however you want to define it, name. We're seeing toolkits that are very general in terms of their capabilities, but they leave behind very definite fingerprints. So I might not be able to say that the elections were hacked by the Russians, but they were hacked by people that like this bit of malware that register their infrastructure in this particular way. Why is it that you think that instead of getting more sophisticated in terms of the latest and greatest toolkit developments, that we don't see more people just rolling out Metasploit with PowerShell command and control or other similar things that blend in with all of the criminal actors and other things and make that attribution question almost impossible, because then you're trying to gauge intent versus building off of a digital fingerprint?
I think that's exactly what you're seeing.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Does anyone want to elaborate, or?
Everybody will agree.
I mean, we are already seeing hybrid attacks that use cyber criminal groups to get in initially, and then a nation state takes over to do the sophisticated stuff. But
okay, nice to see we're on the same page. Thank you.
In Russia, one of the big challenges there is that folks who are authorized to do state-based hacking are also allowed to use the same tools and their time at night to do hacking to make money for themselves. And there's a real blurring between these things. And I don't think you're going to see toolkits that are exclusively one group or the others. People are going to have more access. And fundamentally, though, there's not a great need for people to have these elaborate toolkits. 97% of all cyber incidents start with basic phishing attacks. It's just not a requirement for an attacker to have a laser that shoots through a Pringles can and, does a side channel attack on the mouse.
Great. Question here?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shitesh Kumar. I'm a student at the University of Southern California. Thank you for your time. My question is, in light of the DNC hack and other alleged nation-state cyber operations, to what extent do you think that the warfare rhetoric that's around cybersecurity, especially, I'm going back to the keynote where someone mentioned the idea of a cyber atomic bomb, has influenced the ability of states to respond to events that occur in cyberspace?
Well, the thing that concerns me about what you're getting to is sort of two things. One is that the impact of a lot of cyber attacks impact all of us as people, right? And that is very much missed, and people are kind of left behind this. And secondly, the accessibility. When things are talked in such a military context, it makes the technology and it makes the solutions very inaccessible to most people. And we all need something better, not just the 500 richest companies in the United States, or not just the folks that are regulated by by the SEC or by healthcare folks.
Yeah, we don't have good terms to talk about what's happening, and I think that does influence the discussion, and it makes it difficult for states to talk. As we noted before, that threshold is an important thing because cyber can turn into kinetic pretty quickly if it crosses a threshold of armed conflict. So this warfare term does and can get in the way of the discussions.
Not only for states to talk to, but for just you and I to talk. You know, I mean, I think one of the worst things that's happened in the security industry is folks like me who worked in the defense industrial complex who have come out and have tried to overlay things like concepts like OODA loop to regular people, right? Nobody should know what those things are. You know, the use of cryptonyms as an example to describe actor groups. You know, when I worked at the National Security Agency, cryptonyms, you know, words that cover what you're trying to do, those were a nuisance, right? Nobody really liked them. They make it harder. So the fact that that's used as a marketing ploy by folks creates a lot of confusion, and I'm not sure why, and we need to kind of just get away from that and talk plainly about the problem, because it's not one that's limited to governments or to large companies. It's one that's impacting all of us on a daily basis.
Do we have time for one last question?
Of course we do.
No, sorry. I just want to know what the question
I think
is.
you asked it.
Yeah.
It took our time, Kim. Yeah.
The question was with the Shadow Brokers release and the armament of the cyber civilianry. How do we see the future of cyber warfare changing, especially when it comes to the battlefield? That battlefield is going to become incredibly murky, trying to identify or actually attribute the actions. How do you see that how do you see that changing?
I just think it's going to be
Quickly.
full spectrum, right? You know, operators are going to be on the ground trying to get into a guy's house, and there's going to be operations going on simultaneously that are capturing them on the computer, keeping them located, moving them around, moving their phone. It's going to be the blending of physical and virtual.
It's already there. It's already there, being done all the time. All the technologies are working together. All the teams are working together. If you think about it, the cyber operation, which is not a warfare, just a wrong terminology, is already there. So you see arms on ground, you see, and that was always there. Like agencies working with Army, with cyber tools, with tapping, with all of that. It's always a combined operation.
So let's thank the panelists for their contributions.